I have never felt more like a stick in the mud, a grouchy old man, professor of memory, I guess, if you want to be kind, than when ChatGPT and other exaggeratedly good Markov text generators appeared on the scene, and people started emailing me like crazy. Anthony, how can I use this AI software to help me develop memory palaces, create magnetic images so that I can remember faster and learn more? And I said, nah, 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 nah. That's not the art of memory. And I felt so incredibly alone. Although, to be fair, some people, they gave it a try and they realized, no, the ancient art of memory is still going to be a thing. But I've never felt so much hope than when I started to communicate with Andrew Mayne, who is a major consultant on artificial intelligence projects and who believes very strongly and has every reason to give great arguments for why the art of memory must be preserved, no matter how good artificial intelligence gets. So that's what Andrew Mayne and I are going to talk about today. And on a personal note, I find it so inspiring to be in touch with him because when I was first learning memory techniques, I was in a really deep, dark depression in grad school. And one of the ways that I escaped reality was to learn magic. Now, I'd had an interest in magic since I was very, very young, and it just sort of disappeared into the mist after some little performances at school and so forth. But in graduate school, I came into magic again, and as YouTube was up and coming and people were doing magic on the street and all this kind of stuff, I found people like Andrew, and he did incredible things. And it wasn't just the energy and the uniqueness and the explosively visual characteristic of magic that he brought to his work and his teaching of magic, but he also was one of these really OGs of internet entrepreneurship and really making it possible for people like myself to get great training. So it's not just about magic, but it's about how that you teach people really well and how that you get it in front of eyeballs so that people actually are able to know that it exists and then get it into their system. So he's just an amazing person all around in terms of writing thrilling novels and being an educator and a magician. So his interest in magic you can take seriously, because as we start off in this discussion, magic and memory go together and there's certain issues. But then we get into the AI and we get into hope exploding with abundance for you with a particular mind to figuring out how that we can preserve the ancient, old, dusty books and have the best of modern technology for ourselves and for the entire world. So if you like this kind of content, make sure to hit that thumbs up, get subscribed if you're new here, and pay attention to this spot, because when we think about AI and so forth, it might be a little bit old school and clunky still, but I have started working on an initiative called Time in the Memory Palace Bookshop, a game that you can play, and it should only be a matter of weeks before you can start playing it, but it's not quite ready yet. So make sure to follow this space and let people like me know, not just me, but all the people you love on the internet, that you are deeply involved in their human-created content so that the robots never forget to help us continue to make this world so explosive, so hopeful, and so attenuated and attuned to the ancient art of memory, because as Andrew helps make clear, we're going to need it. Andrew, so great to meet with you and talk to you about shared interests, magic, memory, technology, and I've known your name and your face for a very long time because of work that you did in magic. And so maybe we can start there before we get into AI, because AI is that technology that is now real magic, but maybe a little bit of that history, because I have always wondered with other magicians, the procedural memory element and how you did routining, blocking, and then actually get it into your memory so that, you just have what you need and it just flows and is a natural, organic, or maybe sometimes inorganic. Because I remember you had some tricks that kind of were always in a little bit of or often in a kind of techno edge or somehow, if my memory serves, with things going through things and stuff like that. So maybe a little bit about that background and memory in magic as a procedure.
Yeah, for sure. So I've always leaned towards things that were very visual, and I certainly appreciate. I have a deep love of mentalism because I love magic that can happen inside of your head. But I always sort of, as a magician, I had sort of a visual approach, and so it started trying to think of how things would look. And one of the things was sort of interesting is kind of learning as a student of magic, though, and learning magic and learning how to do card effects, card tricks, and things like this is when you start off, you're told to look in a mirror, and we look in that mirror to see if the move is right and this is right, which is helpful. But then you find out very quickly it can be a distraction because the thing you need to remember so much isn't how it looks, because you're never going to have that POV again of what it looks like from the mirror point of view. What you're going to have to remember is how it feels. And right before the show, you and I are both talking about points at which we go to do something, and that came back to us. And it wasn't so much the visual memory, it was the tactile feel. You put a deck of cards into my hands, and they're going to start to remember all sorts of moves, all sorts of things like this. You give me a piece of paper and say, list 5 tricks that you know for doing, making one card into another. I might think of a couple, but you put the cards in my hand. It's interesting how the different part of the brain takes over, and all of a sudden that comes back, that kinesthetic memory.
Right, right. So were just in general, were there any things that you would do to prepare for, or just in learning? Like, I know you don't, maybe cards is not a strong common reference, but if a routine has certain steps involved and you want it to feel a particular way for the person watching the visual effect, are there any things that you did from a performance get ready stance to really make sure that you remembered the actual process? And I think this could translate to people who are in acrobatics, to music, etc.,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of pulling it off. Basically, I guess is what
Yeah.
I'm thinking.
It starts off where you think about, whether you're an actor in a play or a musician on stage or a magician about to perform a routine. When you first start off, you think, oh, there are 30 things I have to remember. There are 30 things I got to stand here and I got to do this. But as you start to go through rehearsal, as you start to practice it, it starts to come down to just a few things, because by the time I know I need to stand next to my display stand, whatever, by here, my hips already know where to face and whatever. And I remember when I did a tour in Japan years ago, and I was doing a stage show. And it was interesting to me to observe how, when I first started, I had 2 choreographers working with me about all the precise movements, everything I had to do. When I first did that, my first few weeks doing the show, I'm thinking, I got to move here, I got to put my hand, I got to do this. My head is just filled with all the little steps that I have to do. By the end of the run, it had become so automatic. Time seemed to expand. It felt like, a minute on stage felt like 5 minutes on stage, because I was already there. I knew what I needed to do. And then I'm like, okay, well, now what? I'm just waiting for this cue, etc. And so I certainly felt like, watching effective rehearsal, all of a sudden the sense of time changes, and you just start to realize that as you move things from sort of your, in AI, we talk about context. You put something in the context window and you do this. But when you move that to sort of your training and then all of a sudden to the background, then all of a sudden it just automated. And the sense of time was something I really remember a lot.
Right, right. Yeah, that's super interesting. It is a very time-based world to be in, especially with time distortion stuff that you could put
Hmm.
into routines. I guess one more thing I'm thinking about around this is, did you ever do the thing where you memorized snarky comebacks for hecklers or anything like that in advance? Because I've always thought that was quite interesting, and I don't know what I feel about it, but just curious.
Yeah. And I probably would probably agree with where you would go on that, because like, I would remember the stock lines and stuff, but my biggest laughs I ever got were completely improvised in the moment. I remember once like my first cruise ship I'm on, I'm a teenager. I told people I was much older so I could get the booking. And I was in a cabin next to a couple that made full use of the cabin, so to speak. And so I would hear a lot of ooh ah sounds, and I'm on stage and I'm doing the hackiest thing in the world, where I say to the audience, like, this side go ooh, this side go ah, ooh ah, ooh ah, ooh ah, and it hit me like this. I go, you sound like the people in the cabin next door to me. And it was a sincere, honest thing, and the audience just erupted into laughter. And it was just came from this very genuine, kind of thing. And that really showed me like, man, like you either got to be the greatest actor, which I'm not, or just look for those spontaneous moments because I just do not do well with canned lines.
Right, right. Yeah, I've always just kind of rolled with it and never had any response. And anytime I tried, it just didn't sound right or feel right or anything like that.
Yeah, it's there's something about being comfortable enough with the material that you're in the moment. And I was fortunate enough to learn from somebody, Bill Malone, who the magicians out there know who Bill is. And
Hmm.
and Bill knew 1,000 one-liners, but also Bill knew which one-liner, which thing to throw and when to do it. And that timing was really, I said, oh, it's not so much the words you say, it's the opportunity at which you say them. And you only get that by being aware. And so you could rehearse, at the end of your life, all the perfect one-liners. But if you don't know when to deliver it, it's not going to make a difference.
Right, right. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned him because I don't think I can think of a single actual thing he's ever said, but I never would have thought of them as from a repository. They just always come out so fresh and
Mm-hmm.
appropriate in everything that I've ever seen. But yeah, that's so interesting. Um,
I think a funny story was he he was standing at the door. I was walking into like a magic lecture or something like this there, and and I don't know, I had like a 50 cent piece on me, and I just walk in. I'd taken lessons from Bill. I knew Bill, and I go, "Oh, thanks for your work," and I just toss him the 50 cent piece here, right? Without blinking, Bill goes, "Oh, thank you." Dumps in the trash can. Thank you on behalf of the parish. Which is something like that. And just without a beat, had a liner, just turned it into a joke and threw away my 50 cent piece.
you could picture that quite easily if you know Bill Malone.
Yeah.
Well, one of the reasons why I wanted to ask about magic first is because we happen to be meeting on the day that Anthropic talks about AI agents.
Hmm.
And that's an interesting occasion, particularly when we think about processes that work out either in structured ways or spontaneous ways. But also, I'm just interested in, we were talking about being able to preserve the ancient memory techniques at a time when there's so many information gems that seem to be getting deprecated or diminished and so forth. So I just wonder what's the trajectory that gets you interested in memory in the age of AI when it almost feels like, what are we doing with these dusty old memory books? Even though I'm still deeply passionate about them, I see a moment of threat, and even I have to admit, it's just kind of like, wow, what if we don't need this anymore?
Well, I think there's a tremendous value in them. And as a guy that collects some dusty books and stuff, who tries to find stuff, I got Harry Lorraine's book on faces of like memory and all this. I love to collect a lot of a lot of the kind of the older, like older, I mean, not like, some of the 20th century, some of the first writings on this stuff. I love these things because I don't think it's a thing where you have to choose either. I think if you choose both, you really win. So I use ChatGPT every day. I have Windows open. I use Claude. I use whatever's available when I code. I code all the time. I have Cursor open, which has these different models. I make extensive use of these things, but I also have a pack of cards, and I'll sit down in my chair and I'll go work on some memory methods, and I work on memory palace techniques because I think that these technologies are extremely beneficial, but so is learning how to use your own memory, so is learning how our brains work, etc. Because maybe in some future I'm going to sideload stuff into some connected, piece of hardware. Maybe, I don't know. But I do know that, to be a well-rounded person, I should be somebody capable of using these technologies, of reading a book, listening to a podcast, sitting at a dinner party with no devices and having a conversation. And I don't think it is an either or. I actually think that now it's all the more time to start spending a lot more time engaging in these methods and taking classes like yours and learning these things because I think that it makes you, I think, it's more well-rounded. I think it just is. And I fear that, you wonder how, Socrates felt, as writing became more popular and thinking about what's going to happen. And then we can see periods in time from the printing press, which was, absolutely a boon to humanity, incredible for the dissemination of knowledge. But we started to see the slow erosion over time of a lot of memory methods in schools and whatnot, because I think we forgot why we use them. And sometimes it's very hard to appreciate downstream the effect of this. You might find that, hey, everybody learning from a book, hey, they passed their test, that's fine. cool. 10 years from now, if I ask the student a question about biology or cellular mitosis, et cetera, if they don't really have a really good method for how they learned it, then they're going to have trouble recalling it. And they're going to be more dependent upon those sorts of tools,
Right.
which maybe doesn't make us as dynamic as thinkers as we'd like to be.
I'm glad you mentioned Socrates because we're at a moment where someone can now just like pause our conversation, go look up Socrates in memory and get a brief overview of it. But will they really understand what Socrates is gunning for? Because I think Socrates is not really concerned about memory. I think what he's concerned about is that you're prepared to engage in the dialectic in the sense that
Mm-hmm.
you just mentioned, right? It's not just, oh, I know how to look that up and I know how to refresh my memory of it. It's that you have it inside of you. And if
Mm-hmm.
you are on the battlefield of ideas, you can be a good citizen. I think that's what he's really concerned about, is that people will
I
no longer be able to defend themselves in discussion.
and I agree with that. And I think we lost a lot of that. I've, worked watching being in a meeting at OpenAI before ChatGPT came out and not having any concept of how big this thing was going to go. And then a few months later, watching schools panic and people and teachers in kind of an uproar of like, oh my God, this thing, it's a cheating machine, whatever. And having worked in education and worked in projects trying to promote critical thinking, my response has been, if you're really a if you're teaching your students the way you should teach them, this shouldn't impact that at all. Because at the end of the day, the test of your ability as a teacher is that student should be able to get up, stand up in front of the class, and defend their idea. Not produce a piece of paper that you don't know if they worked on it, their parent worked on it, their tutor worked on it, or ChatGPT worked on it. We need to know the ideas are in their head and they can defend them and they can explain them and do that. And ChatGPT can be a way to getting that information in your head. But when your measure of an output of somebody can be replicated by an AI, then it's probably more a question of how you're measuring that output than what the technology is doing.
Right, right. Yeah. So in terms of helping kids get there and with your educational background, you mentioned to me a haiku project that you had students do, which
Oh
sounded
yeah.
quite fascinating and the kind of thing that, to my mind, relates to memory, especially like the idea of the memory wheel, where you're computing things in order to put things in place. So maybe say a bit more
Mhm.
about the haiku exercise.
Yeah, I used to run a critical thinking program, and it was in high schools. It'd be an after-school program. Was actually underwritten by Johnny Carson, who was a famous talk show host, years ago, The Tonight Show, who loved magic, loved critical thinking, loved science. He found out what I was doing first when I was a student myself, and then later on, and he underwrote it. And I tried to think of what are hands-on projects. It's one thing to have somebody read a thing. It's another for somebody to experience something. And I wanted to sort of explain how we can sometimes complete randomness occasionally produces order. And we might assume that order implies that there was some sort of intentionality behind it when necessarily wasn't. And so what I would do is I would have students write letters on little pieces of paper and we put them to a coffee can, shake up the coffee can, and then one student be at the front of the classroom at the whiteboard. And we'd call out the letters one by one and they'd start to put them into a matrix, like a 20 by 20 matrix. And they do that. And then they would look for words that appeared there diagonally across, whatever. And you'd start to see words like hat and dog and shoe or whatever. You'd actually start to see words. So we'd write down the words onto slips of paper, put that into the coffee can, shake them up, and then pull words out until we reach 17 syllables. And the idea was to see, could we just randomly generate haiku? And you would, in, about span of 30, 40 minutes, you would start to get 17 syllable haiku. And it might be like, dog, hat, eat, stove, whatever. And you get some of them kind of sounded kind of like hit poetry, whatever. And then as a final step, would have the students, in this case, there was a teen poetry night at the local library. They would take it there, go up on stage, not tell anybody what the source of this was, but read their haiku and see the reaction that they got from the audience. And they would go in and get applause. And I remember them coming back to me all excited, like they thought it was real. They thought it was this. It's like, well, it's in the eye of the beholder, but it was a fascinating process for them to experience how just you can get order out of random things and then the audience can assign meaning to it when maybe there wasn't.
Right, right. Well, that takes my mind in two different directions. I mean, first, is there an analogy to be made to what ChatGPT is doing with this sort of haiku generation
Mm-hmm.
process? And the other thing is you mentioned since Johnny Carson came up, just any talk show host that has a comedic opening. I mean, isn't that what the comedy writers are doing? They're just seeing the randomness of whatever's going on in politics, and this is today's show. So we'll put this together into something that has meaning, and the audience actually makes it have more meaning than it actually does in terms of the words, because they also know what's happening in the news. Is that?
I I have two anecdotes about that. One was prior to release of GPT-4, um, I was handling some of the comms for the release of that, like, finding examples and showing here's the cool things it can do. I don't know if you saw the example of take a photo of what's in your refrigerator and see if it can figure out a meal for you. That literally was sitting here 2 a.m. at night thinking, how can I show the vision capabilities? Like, oh, what if we do this? And so that was one of the examples. And then looking for other ones. And then I said, what if I give it today's news? And I say, can you write a monologue
All
for
right.
like the talk show tomorrow night? And it wrote me like 10 jokes. The next night I watched the major talk shows and three of those jokes were used. Three of the jokes were just, which would have implied the other ones were probably somewhere on the floor of the writers' rooms. And that was both amusing and a little bit disturbing to realize that GPT-4 was able to write monologue jokes as well as these talk show hosts, which I don't know if it says a lot about GPT-4 or where comedy has come to. But that was an interesting to me. The other thing I'll give an example though is have you used the voice mode with GPT-4 where you talk to it?
Somebody who read one of my books came and visited me in Germany, and he had it on voice, and he said it for me. But I was so paranoid because it was really quite new, and I just sort of said, "Oh,
Yeah.
I won't put my voice in it now, but you go ahead and demonstrate."
Fair enough. So yeah, the voice mode, what it is, instead of typing text into it, you can have a conversation. And the new mode listens for pauses, et cetera, and it has a very natural sort of way in which you can interact with it. And there's a weird effect where if you type into ChatGPT and ask it a question, it gives you a response, whatever. You're like, okay, good, whatever. When you put it into voice mode, it's essentially the same model. Now, the technical thing about how it uses, audio tokens, et cetera, but essentially the same level of reasoning, same capabilities, whatever. It sounds smarter. It sounds more authentic. And just by hearing an AI that's speaking in a way that sounds with natural cadences and ums and ahs, whatever, it is a very, very strange effect. So all of a sudden, I'm starting to give this thing much more weight, even though it's the same model that I'm using to just text with.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, my paranoia in that instance was a bit misguided because my voice and my face are there's like thousands of hours of it, right? But
Yeah,
nonetheless,
you're out there.
there's still that spooky kind of feeling in some sense. What do you think generates the? I mean, there just seems to be a complete polarization between people who are all in, and then people who have that kind of. I had a somewhat of a reluctance and an uncanny valley sort of feeling about it.
I think caution's good. I think it's fine for, when we had put out, when we first had one of the models came out there, and I think Nick Cave had said something about like, I'm never going to use this or whatever. And inside OpenAI, we were showing the article and like, good. We want some people to just kind of be skeptical into whatever, and particularly artists and other people who say, I just want to do things the way I did it or whatever. And it wasn't like this, oh, look at this guy. We're like, oh no, we would be a little disappointed if somebody like him just leaped into you. He's very different than, let's say, a Brian Eno or something like this. So I would say that I think that we need to have a lot of different kind of reaction to these things. And I think that I advise people who are extremely all in to sort of, hey, every now and then stop and check where we are. I would advise people who are extremely skeptical or concerned, be a little exploratory, but under conditions that you feel safe about it. AI is not a thing that goes away. It's not a thing that's going to vanish, but it doesn't mean it's a thing that everybody tomorrow has to incorporate to every aspect of their life and just accept everything that comes out. Everybody at their own pace. I encourage people to just ask questions and find out more. My biggest concern is that there is, kind of like a lot of, I read a lot of tech reporters describe stuff and I watch them get things wrong. I watch some pundits out there who are there's AI, they present themselves as skeptics, but they're more cynics who just flat out make statements like that. That wasn't even true a year ago. This is way past that capability, et cetera. But
Mm.
it's be a critical thinker and, figure out it on your own terms.
Yeah, I often think of something Tony Buzan told me years ago before he passed away, which was always focus on what can go right, which I think is very good
Mhm.
advice, especially with these kinds of issues. Back to this situation where you were feeding news events to get monologues, and sort of the coincidence that I would talk about that, and then you're like, I already did that sort of thing. One thing that's interesting about that to me, and I can be misreading perhaps the ancient texts, those dusty old memory texts, but I think that that's kind of what people like Ramon Lowell were at least intuiting with the memory wheel. And what Bruno was, I think, very much talking about was a a limited set of characters, let's say, that can be arranged infinitely, but not quite, because
Mm-hmm.
the infinite expression will collect into sets, and then those sets will have recursion that refer back to the sets that they belong to. So I don't know that much about, Gödel's incompleteness theorem or all that sort of stuff, but in my uh, basic outsider understanding of these things, that makes sense to me that you and I would be both thinking of monologues for talk show hosts, and then of course you would then feed that in, and then those exact jokes would appear, because there's only so many possible things in the set of sets without it referring back to itself. Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, we think a lot about, their patterns. I'm a writer, so I write, thriller mystery, and, the difference between there's a couple reasons why those are different. And I'm certainly aware when I sit down to write, error is a pattern. And Aristotle described, these patterns, and they kind of hold true to this day. And that's part of the reason why, particularly when you get into a thing like, it's a late show monologue, which is an institution that's been around for 60 years, that there's going to be a certain amount of predictability to it in that pattern. And so I think some things absolutely lend themselves to that. Where you find things fall apart, which people struggle with and AI struggle, is when you get into things that are more complex patterns, that I have to set something up here, do this here. It's why an AI can't really write a competent novel right now. It's because there's a lot more complexity there. I'll share, something that was sort of interesting to me, and you bringing up Tony Buzan sort of, made me think about this, was when, you know, we started to do research into like what's going on inside these large language models, these LLMs, because you train it on a bunch of data and you start to find they behave very similar. You find out that models trained by completely different companies will often tell you similar jokes, similar things like this. Some of it's because they're training on the same data, but sometimes it's the grouping. You may remember, a while ago when they were looking at human brains and started to realize that they found, kind of like neurons, like there was the Halle Berry neuron, which was that in a lot of people, there's, if you showed them an image of Halle Berry, the same cluster of neurons in the brain would fire. There's
Oh,
a
wow.
Spider-Man neuron. People in Western culture, you show them Spider-Man, another cluster fires. This when we looked into AI models and we could actually figure out from all these parameters and regions into looking for firing, we saw there were clusters like that. We found a Spider-Man kind of group of parameters like neurons. We found these things. And
Wow.
so you certainly see as a product of our culture, you find these patterns that sort of, it's kind of like if somebody says, hey, I really like Star Wars and I really like Game of Thrones, I'm like, well, you're going to love Dune, because I know there are these patterns that are present in both these things. These things tend to be kind of grouped towards that. And it's neat and interesting to see them. AI models are very different than human brains. I don't want to say like that, but there is this way that information organizes itself that starts to follow those patterns.
Right, right. Yeah. I mean, I don't even know where to go there, because there's just too many places. But if we curve back or recurse back to memory techniques, what do you think about the use of ChatGPT, let's say, for generating mnemonics? Because I have mixed feelings about it, but in terms of, your own practice, what's going to be better? Is it going to be that you understand the theory and you can enact it, or you have an interstitial activity where you go and consult to get ideas for mnemonics?
Yeah, I've built probably a dozen different apps to help me, learn to memorize. And the things I find out that work really well are things that help me build fundamental skills. One of the first things I did GPT-4 is I had it see if it could help me build memory palaces. And one of my first examples of that was I said, can you use the McDonald's example? The golden arch is, Remus and Romulus, and you going through here, and had a very good example of this but it made me appreciate it. It's like when you read a book, when you read somebody else's book about their memory palaces, one hand, I enjoy that kind of like, how did you solve this? Other hands, I don't really remember them as well because those things had more meaning to them.
Mm.
And I think that we know that the more hand you have in creation, the more points of contact you have in creation, the more you build the scaffold, probably the better it is. And so I think that some people, I think it can be helpful for trying to say, hey, I can't come up with a really good mnemonic for this. Oh, great, it came up with that. But, I realized the thing that I needed to do is I built an app to really just help me with my, combining words with visual images. And so I would just literally give me two random words and I have to sit there and think about how I would connect these in my head. And that made me much quicker. That helped me. I built an app for memorizing faces, which just flashes me faces. And I have to get good at speed because I realized that faces is hard because the only time you generally get a practice is when you're at a party. And sometimes it's the worst time to practice because you don't get as much time to do that. So I'll build tools to help me practice, but when it comes to building the real methods, I'll sit there late at night and just try to walk through it and explore.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, I've puzzled my head. I even went to an incubator to work on a wireframe and do some initial testing on an app. And I just thought there's no truth to this. I mean, it literally,
Hmm.
it could be an activity, but I can't see it coming to the accomplishment. But you making your own app, to me, that makes sense, because you would have an intuition of what would help you. And we're
Yeah.
almost at that point. You just tell the ChatGPT what do you want to code, and now each
Yeah.
person could make their own app.
A thing that I think was the most effective thing for me, kind of use of technology, and it wasn't ChatGPT, was going into Quest and using Tilt Brush, the paint program. And because you can go into Tilt Brush. Have you ever played with this? It's
No.
it's it's a remarkable to use your controllers and you can paint and you can scale up and scale down. And you can go inside of there and construct a memory. You can literally put objects in places and stuff and you can manipulate and move it. And the reason I was drawn to that is because the first time I ever did like real depth 3D where you could move around, I still have a very vivid memory of that experience because it felt like a real place to me. And that's the thing that I thought about. Now you talked about you've had some things you posted recently showing like images and stuff, and like, and something I've read about some people who've used like architectural magazines and are very good at putting themselves into this other medium. For me, it's strongest if it's actual real physical space I've explored. And I think that's what's interesting to me is to say that I don't want to replace a thing that shouldn't be replaced. Like I've seen people create like, talk about, mind mapping, and then I use this AI to generate a mind map. I'm like, well, that's not really what a mind map's supposed to be. The mind map is you extending outwards and feeling this thing because that's the truth to it. So I think there's opportunity there to use these things the right way. But you have to think of like, am I replacing something that shouldn't be replaced? We've seen data on this where students who handwrite notes during class have a higher retention than students that type those students and have a higher retention than the ones who just record it. And it's because, yeah, you're employing more aspects of your brain to encode it.
Right. Do you think that will always be the case, or is it just that these technologies haven't been around enough for us to elaborate our interaction with them? I mean, I have a guess, but I'm not sure it's an evolutionary thing. I think it's a depth of spatial depth thing, because where is the middle of a book in a screen? It's like always just the flat surface.
Mm-hmm.
But
No,
I don't
I,
know.
I, I, no, I 100% agree because like I have Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy in my nightstand over there because I've been working on trying to actually memorize parts of the book and where they are in the book. If it's a Kindle and it's just literally a page location, like maybe I could figure that out. But literally, yeah, I think that we are very much creatures of a 3D environment. We're social creatures, and these things don't go away. And I think that, we can, as much as we exist in an online environment, there's a reason the graphical user interface took over and the command line didn't. For hardcore techies would argue, but once we could say, oh, well, my trash is down there. This is where I go email. And that's when all of a sudden people go, oh, I get this now. And other people are frustrated, like, why do you need this abstraction? Why do you need this? It's like, I don't know, several million years of evolution, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, that is an interesting way to think about it. Because if we do the like command line versus visual thing, I mean, the app that I made is just to learn like a 00 to 99 PAO. It's just cards with numbers on them. And then
Mhm.
I don't know what the analogy would be. The major system, 2 is N and 8 is a F or V. So I have Navy. Actually, the GI Joe character is Shipwreck, but I'm like going from command line to shipwreck, he's my trash or my icon on the desktop, right? But nonetheless, it's still like basic command line to there, and it is that writing effect, I think, that helps it, as opposed
Yeah.
to me just picking up an app and it's like, okay, so 28 could be all of these potential figures. Pick one. Is it that I've earned it somehow, or not just writing, but it's
I
earned?
yeah, I literally have my box of numbers here, and I think I've been working on people working in a lot of being asked to do a lot of biological research stuff, and so I've switched to using my AP flashcards and stuff too, and certainly when you transfer, it certainly I think time spent, there's in compute we talk about compute time, we talk about inference time. And when you spend time investing in a thing, thinking about a thing, doing a thing, and often from a different point of view, the problem is often people say, well, I spent 5 hours going over the same passages in the textbook over and over again. Like, well, yeah, that's going to be diminishing returns. But if you said, hey, I spent 30 minutes reading it, and then I spent 30 minutes having a discussion with friends, and then I spent 30 minutes acting that out. Well, now you're engaging all different parts of your brain. And so you're going to have a much better effect. One of the things I think has been exciting, which I think is really where I think these things can be very helpful, is using, I don't know how much, as a musician, I don't know how you feel with this. I don't know how much you played with Suno or Udio, the music generation software.
Uh, I think the last software I played with was Fruity Loops, which I don't think is a
Okay.
thing anymore.
So odd music generation has become incredibly capable of AI. And what's neat is we're seeing a lot of musicians now use it to accompany them. I know guitarists that will play their guitar riffs and then they'll have the AI generate the accompaniment for it. And so I'm seeing a lot of artists that are using this enhancement because they can't find three other people to go do this, et cetera. But what's cool too is I found that for memorization, if you say, hey, I've got 10 things about the French Revolution, you can go in and write 10 things and say, write a song about this. And it's one of the things I think is absolutely amazing is that there are people I know who have terrible memories, but a song can release the day before, and then today they can sing the song. And I'm like, how can you have a bad memory if you can remember the lyrics and do this stuff? So I think that's one of the things exciting about is for studying is to say, oh, let me take these things I have to remember, have a song created for this, and I'm going to put this into my playlist. And the music is an amazing memory method too, because that it fits into these patterns and it sets up as if I remember this part, then it connects to that part, etc. But
So how far are we, do you think, from actually being able to do that with reasonable certainty that it's going to create a song that doesn't have hallucinations, so that we're not memorizing false history or fake facts about biology or whatever? Or
I
is it the case that
my
because humans also make that mistake, there'll always be mistakes in the data?
so hallucinations come from several different points. So my favorite teacher, I had a wonderful teacher in high school, had him for several classes, had the most hallucinated ideas about Egyptology and things like that, though. The thing I knew when to listen to him, when not to listen to him. At the time, I didn't know, and then later on. So hallucinations, think about this, is that the models, as models become better trained, if you go from GPT-1 to GPT-3, then GPT-3 and GPT-4, the rate of hallucinations drops. And a hallucination is basically these models are trying to determine probabilities. If I ask it a question, what year did Tom Hanks fly to the moon? And people go, oh, it always gets it wrong. I'm like, well, it's kind of going, it's doing two things. There's things called embeddings, which is sort of a fuzzy representation of a thing. And the other thing is sort of probability. Well, if Tom Hanks played an astronaut, in Apollo 13, and a model might kind of go, did you mean what year did Apollo 13 take place in? And we go
Right.
like, and there's a lot of times you get answers like, no, there's actually a reason why this is actually kind of correct if you understand it's trying to assume what you mean. There's other times it just makes up stuff. If you go take these tiny models, you could run on your computer now. You can go download. Go to olama.com. You can download like a 1 billion parameter model, very tiny, fits on about a gigabyte, and ask it questions. It'll answer things. You can have a conversation with it. When you start to get into factual information, like I'll ask it, my test is about Harry Houdini. I know a lot about Harry Houdini, and I'll watch a model give me three things that are true, and then start to go off the deep end. Small models hallucinate a lot. Newer models are much better at going, you know what? I can't verify that. It'll stop. It'll just you get less hallucinations there. So my metric is does it hallucinate more than my favorite teacher, you know? And
Right,
I think that we're getting superhuman now in a lot of things, particularly domain specific models where they're going to hallucinate at a far less rate than people. And there are little tricks too you can do, by the way. Like you can check for that. Like I'll use a lot of small models to do stuff. Be like, oh, they hallucinate a lot. I'm like, yeah, but this model trained by this lab and this model trained by this lab are going to hallucinate in completely different ways. Where they agree, I know is a fact. Where they disagree is very likely hallucination.
right. Well, that's interesting, and that's good to know. What about freedom? So I've asked it to give me certain things. Either I've just said these demonic examples you're giving, they're not extreme enough. Put some gusto in there. And it has told me I don't feel comfortable doing that because I put in certain actions that I would actually use, and even ones Nelson Dellis has told me. Because Nelson Dellis told me something interesting when I asked him about people being uncomfortable about having junk in their minds, which fair enough, right? But he just said, "Look, I want to win the competition, so I'm going to do it."
Yeah.
But ChatGPT won't do it for me. It actually says statements like, "I'm not comfortable helping you with that." And Claude, I think, is the one that's more likely to do that. But I'm just thinking,
Mhm.
where's my freedom now, right? Like who coded this in there that puts a ceiling on what's appropriate for this
I
human?
I had many discussions internally about where I think those limits should be, which is
Mm.
probably beyond the horizon.
Right.
And but there's when you're a company, you're held accountable, and sometimes for ways that may not be fair, in the
Mm.
sense that you and I who say, hey, I should be able to use this however I want, but then somebody says, hey, well, a 15-year-old kid asked it this question and said this, or somebody who had just lost their wife was asking and had started talking about suicide or something. Like all these sorts of cases and stuff that responsible companies are saying, okay, we want to move the frontier, but carefully, because one, you're afraid of bad PR, but also genuinely afraid of a bad outcome. These models, particularly OpenAI, have become, I think, a bit more, have allowed a lot more. I think they should allow a lot more, but the beautiful thing about open source is you can take, a base model created by somebody else and you can retrain it, you can do it, and you can kind of do a lot of what you want. If you find out that it's too restrictive, then there's other options out there. And I think that's the way it should be. I find that, because also these models are good at some things, but they're not, I can train something better to help me construct memory palace mnemonics than these models are, because they're trained on whatever the average sort of assumption or understanding that is.
Right.
But I think there's users, be able to use these things and let us do that. And I've run into that with, Claude, which I think is a very capable model, where I was like doing, exploratory fiction and stuff. And I had, I'm like, what if Hitler got a time machine? Like what, like a crazy, as a writer is like, oh, it's an amazing idea. As a human, it's horrible. But you go to Claude, it's like, no, I refuse. I'm like, this is a fiction story. Like, I'm not going to give Hitler a time machine, but it's so afraid of that. And, I think we need to think about too is, Google put out, they had a search feature where they were doing AI generated answers. And some were really dumb, like, using glue to hold cheese to bread and pizza or whatever. And there was such a big backlash. I think a little bit of ridicule is fine, but it was like, give them room to create cool stuff,
Mm.
because as long as we're pretty sure nobody's going to try to make glue pizza, I think we're okay. But if you tell these people like, no, it's got to be perfect or not at all, well, you're never going to have any technology.
Yeah, it seems so tricky. I think a lot of that bitterness maybe comes from the fact that you have to use it and you can't participate in it, or at least your participation is that you're the product, and we all sort of know it. So I think some of that backlash or that's part of the backlash. Uh,
Yeah, yeah. It feels like sometimes the thing that's happening to us.
yeah.
And I would say that the other side of it, though, is somebody who uses this on a daily basis and advises on how it's used and advises in the building this stuff, is you can be a domain expert in some of this areas and how to apply this, and you can be the person kind of guiding other people how to use it, which then works its way backward, where people go, oh, this is really what we need to think about doing.
Mm. Do you this is kind of like a super philosophical question, or maybe it's a not a super one in the sense of good, but like just a silly one. But when you observe what we are doing as a species, with people, members, and corporations, and initiatives, and just startups, etc. Do you feel like anybody actually is in control, or is it evolution that's driving us to make this happen almost just because we see, you know, the end of our star or our sun, and that we've got to do something to get this particular consciousness out? Because I can't quite account for the rush, I can't quite account for our apocalyptic thinking about nature and all this sort of stuff, other than that something is urging the entire species to get off the planet. It sounded a bit wild, but I just wonder what you think.
Well, well, there was a point in time when all of our species existed in a very narrow band in Africa.
Mm.
And due to climate and other reasons, we were bottlenecked and came that close to extinction. And then we started to expand it. And by the way, Neanderthals had already made it out, but we were distant related, but our immediate ancestors were still there. And I think that the further we go, the more we flourished, because several things happen. Is one, from a genetic point of view, is you spread your genes across, a larger area. And that means that if all of a sudden this area goes through a drought, volcanic eruption, whatever, your chances of survival go up. But you also create these little pockets of innovation and different ideas. And, we've had this acceleration in the last, 2 centuries, because we've been able to really, there's our tool use and our information use. And our information use is something we don't talk about as much, but our information use increased dramatically. And when you started to be able to collect the best ideas from everybody, that was great. But I still think that idea, that urge to sort of explore and to expand, is still there in many people. And I hope that never stops, because that's part of what makes us human, is the fact that, we were able to make home on almost now we've made home on every continent on the planet.
Mm.
We're the only species that really does that. And I think that it's part of it is I think is the information acceleration. As we accelerate ideas, and you see these pockets of that. You look at ancient Greece, when you had these island city states that were part of trade networks, and the ones that were getting the ships and the travelers and the people coming through there were getting more information and flourishing. You look at Venice, you look at these points in time where these information networks are bringing information, you get that flourishing, and then hopefully you get the expansion. Is anything driving it? Yeah, I think it's just it is part of survival. I think it's what's made our species survive.
Mm. Yeah, it is such an interesting situation that we're in, where we kind of feel that every day. It's like the structure that is constantly present, or the electricity that just is constantly humming. I sometimes wonder if that's what Tesla was trying to improve, or something, like to tap into that depth of fundamental electricity, so to speak, that would, maybe if it was cleaner, it would somehow operate better. I'm not sure, but
Yeah,
those are ideas that come to mind.
well, but yeah, I mean, at that point, I think that once we become very aware of how information spread and ideas spread, or they're part of a bigger community, and then you think about terms like zeitgeist and things like this, and Tesla being a guy that came about, post telegraph, and the telegraph was an amazing achievement, because you think about that, the telegraph allowed for the instantaneous communication, and you think about the point at which, when we put the first transatlantic telegraph cable, up until that point, we had to wait for everything to come via ship. And then all of a sudden, we've now wired the planet in such a way. It was fascinating. And then we had, a solar event, which fried all the telegraphs and made us aware that we're still beholden to, events beyond our control. And then repaired them. But that's the thing. We forget these moments where all of a sudden, oh my God, what happened? The radio coming into the home. The radio meant that you could be in rural Oklahoma on a farm, and every night turn it on and listen to, somebody talking. I think that's largely beneficial. Of course, some crazy guy from Austria and Germany, realized he could also use this to record himself and be heard 24/7, ever present, everywhere, and use it, to manipulate people in a bad way. But, I think the net benefit of these things, but we all become aware of this connectedness in some way. And I think that's certainly what I think, Tesla saw this idea of, what if you had ever present electricity everywhere? What if you didn't have to think about the cost for that? I think that's, it is a neat idea to think about. I think about the things that I take for granted of everybody having access to it. My wife's from India, and I go to India and I see, the heads of the most advanced technology companies in the world are often from India, but you go into India and you see this extreme polarity there. And I think about, what would it take for, this person whose job is literally sleeping on, a rack above the street fixing shoes to have the same educational opportunity I have. And I realize the answer is AI, is because there's not another person there to spend time to be that person's tutor, but AI can solve for this. And when I think about, like, my vision of what would be wonderful and present is everybody having access to intelligent systems and information in a way that really, allows us to have the opportunity at least to uplift ourselves.
Right. Yeah, I hope it happens, that it just gets to everywhere. I mean, it's so bizarre to me that Africa or India or whatever is just struggling to have internet in certain places, and really excited about. I mean, it's got its own scariness in a way, but
Mm-hmm.
really excited about the idea of Starlink or something like that being
Well,
able to just get us all connected.
we see interesting things happen. Like, I have a friend from Kenya, and she talks about when she was a little girl, the number of telephones in the country of, hundreds of millions of people was like very limited. And then the cell phone comes out, and now everybody has a cell phone. And here in the West, we kind of take a spoiled sort of view, like, oh, well, really, is that really any better? Like, well, if you're a melon farmer and you've got a bunch of them do you want to sell, and you don't know if you should go to the market down to the north or the market to the west, and making the wrong choice means you're not going to sell any today. That's not good. But if you can call your cousin and he can tell you, oh yeah, they're out of them here, they need to buy them, and you can call your friend and borrow the pickup truck and deliver them there because a cell phone made that possible. That's an incredible benefit. We've seen the economic benefits of these places go up tremendously. I did a study where I had a researcher go talk to 2 dozen teachers around the world to see how ChatGPT is being used in the classrooms. Every teacher we talked to was enthusiastic about it. And, we talked to a teacher in South Africa who talked about one of her students who English wasn't her first language. She was from a township. And so she struggled when she was in class and was embarrassed whenever she had to speak or give a report. Now, because of that, in a world where there's not enough opportunity to provide her the tutor to help her through this, she might be limited in her economic opportunities because, being able to speak, being multilingual, particularly speaking English, is very, very helpful. They gave her access to ChatGPT. She could practice her English. She could ask it questions. How do I say this? How do I do this? Without fear of embarrassment. And that was one of the critical things we kept coming back to us was when you talk to an AI, you're not worried about embarrassment. Yeah, it's not a person. It's not an entity like you or I. It just gives you a response. They watched her confidence increase. They watched all of a sudden she went from a point of view of being afraid to speak in class, now feeling more comfortable in speaking in class because she got to rehearse it. She got to run through it a bunch of times and then
Mm.
go do it. And that's what exciting to me is the idea that the things that I take for granted that, having parents that I could ask in an endless amount of questions to, that could come home at 6 o'clock and be there for me. You take kids who parents aren't going to be home till late at night because they're working or they have one parent or whatever, and there's not money to afford private tutoring, which is something we take for granted in wealthier communities, and that's not the norm for around the world. That's what's exciting to me is this. You listen to what Abraham Lincoln talking about being able to have a book as a kid, what it meant to even have a book to read, which we take for granted now. And then you think about what's it going to be like for having a kid having access to ChatGPT that may not have a library or may not have books in the home, but all of a sudden has this. That's wonderful.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned that. I haven't finished it yet, or I haven't edited it, but I have a story where the it's called Lucy Meets Lincoln, and it's like a story that teaches memory techniques. And she gets a time machine that goes back to meet Lincoln, and they're in a bookstore, and Lincoln is like, "You got to read this book," and it's like a Giordano Bruno book. Anyway, I got to finish
Oh,
that
wow.
eventually. But that leads me to think about, you know, what is it like for you as someone who has written so much fiction, and like how do you remember? I think of Michael Connolly saying one time that he doesn't really remember any of his previous books. It is just and with him he's written so many over so many decades, so fair enough. But like, how is it for you? Do you have a strong memory of the different I want to come back to what we were talking about things getting better and better, because I got a angle here, so I haven't abandoned it. But how is your memory of your own writing, and how does it just work generally to do so much fiction, as someone who uses memory
Um,
techniques?
Terrible. And I have a terrible memory of what I've written. And the part of it is because I I spend a lot of time thinking about my plot and I outline, and then I write and I turn in my first draft. And I don't really come back to the book again until I get it back from my editors, and I have to go through and do that. Thankfully, my editors have like these spreadsheets which show like who the characters' parents are, their relations for this. I can go back and look at that, and I will find myself going to write the next book. I know a lot about my characters, their inner states and things like that. But if I said their uncle's name was this or things like that, and it didn't come up, like I have a very, very bad memory for that. You know, I could tell you more about books I've read than the books I've written.
Interesting.
And it's part of it because also it's like I like to write really in the moment. And so I write generally almost all my books have been first character POV. And so when I think about that, I'm very much care how are they reacting? How are they handling this thing in there? So I could tell you vividly how a character would probably handle a scene, would probably write it the same way you guessed again. But yeah, you know, I'm always impressed by authors that just, and I have readers that just know way more about my characters than I do.
Yeah, that's a good sign that they're that involved, I guess.
Or a sign of my incompetence. So
Well, I mean, the brain will deprecate things that aren't quite
yeah.
useful in the moment, but I think that's very interesting. I'm always surprised by the way I've written things and how that it's never quite the way that I remember the actual instrument, so to speak. So I'll remember the story quite well, and I'll remember the characters quite well, but the actual nature of the language and some of the ways that things are done is just like, who wrote this? It's so alien to me. But the memory is generally good. Anyway, the reason why I wanted to ask that is I don't get to talk to writers often enough, especially of fiction. But this theme where we left off of things getting better, and it's just so obvious that a farmer is going to have a better time if they can, you know, check what's the fastest path to this or that market, and are there fuel stations along the way, etc. It seems to me that there's this world we live in, and I don't know if it's true or not, but it's a world that our fiction has helped develop. So when I was a kid, Star Trek had devices in the hand, and now we have devices in the hand. And when I was in university, I discovered this thing called pataphysics. And pataphysics is literally the science of the virtual, where, you know, what would the time machine look like if you could actually build one? And then a pataphysician would write the actual time machine guide for how to build it, that sort of thing. And back to Star Trek, when I was a kid, it was very popular, these manuals that show how the Starship Enterprise was actually, you know, could be a thing. And it's this
Michael
virtual
Acuto, I
imagination.
have those. Yeah, I
Yeah, yeah.
remember those. Yeah.
But it's almost as if we use fiction to magically somehow push ourselves towards the real thing. Now, the real thing turns out to be different than was imagined, but
Mm-hmm.
nonetheless, there it is. And I'm sure there's oodles of examples where that just never happened. But I think if you think from Jules Verne to Star Trek, like just the nature of what happens in science fiction stories, especially hard SF, you know, it's wow. Like it's almost like we wrote this program and then we realized it.
I have a book over here which was Arthur C. Clarke's Profiles of the Future.
Oh, okay.
And he wrote this in 1960. And Arthur C. Clarke was great because Arthur C. Clarke described the geostationary satellite before it was a thing. He figured out, you know, how far out you had to be from the Earth to have what would be keep that relative position, et cetera. Um, the book is great because it's him talking about the future, and he talks about things much like, you know, what the internet became in the World Wide Web and a lot of things. He was very big into hovercraft, which didn't pan out so well, but very on the ball about things. At OpenAI, Sam Altman asked me if we could get the rights to do a reprint of it. So we did that. We did our own special edition of it because we wanted everybody to see this, a very forward-thinking science fiction writer imagine a future. And part of the reason I got into memory techniques was in working on that, I came across a section where we talked about what would happen if you could compress or expand time. And when it came to learning, and that made me think very much about how little attention we pay towards learning techniques, and you know, started to get into kind of a deep dive there, and you start to think about what would a future thing work like. And I think that science fiction plays a wonderful role in that. And sometimes too is that, you know, it's funny, like I've always been a big science fiction fan. I started writing a couple sci-fi stories and I switched to thriller mystery because frankly there was just a bigger audience for it, but I always put a lot of science into my books. And back in 2010, I wrote a book called Angel Killer about a woman in the FBI who came from a family of stage magicians. And I wanted to come up with a very clever sort of antagonist. And I had one that was killing people, but there was always something odd about each person. It turned out that each one of them was identical to somebody else, but they weren't, as far as they know, twins. And I said, well, how would they do this? How would they find people that you would think it was this person, but it's actually somebody else got killed? And so it was a kind of a weird, perverse plot. And I said, oh, well, they're probably using some service where you could just look at somebody's photo and find it on social media and get their name. And I just wrote a thing, called it Face Place, whatever, type this up. They didn't exist. The Clear Eye, the companies that did that actually didn't exist at that time. And it wasn't until a couple of years later those things started to came out. But you just assumed because the technologically it was possible, and maybe there was something that was there that I wasn't aware of, but I didn't look it up, but I just sort of assumed it was there. I looked at, one of the things they did too was they would fake, they would basically fake conversations with other people because he was using deep fakes, basically, recreating the way somebody looked, but he would talk to somebody and alter his face and his voice. Deep fake wasn't a word then, wasn't a term then. Deep fakes didn't come about till like 5 years later. But you could look at the progression of AI and know that, okay, before I generate a completely new image, it'll probably be easier to take an existing image and then map a face onto it and do this sort of stuff. And I'd say a lot of sci-fi is actually there's actually, ideas in the zeitgeist that you can pick up upon. And then later something happens and we kind of forget that that was there. Like, we talk about the World Wide Web and we kind of forget about AOL and CompuServe and BBSs and stuff. And, I was online. You were probably online before everybody else discovered the internet browser. And then we kind of think of like, oh, it was just the PC and then the internet browser. Like, no, there was PC and CompuServe and AOL and portals, etc. And then that came about. So I think a lot of ideas are out there, and sometimes science fiction writers can just sort of pick upon these and sort of magnify them a bit, but they're kind of already in progress.
What do you think will be the way these histories get told? So I'm a big fan of correspondences. And one thing that really bugs me is I can't figure out how I will get the correspondences of people who used email in some future book, right? So I've got Ezra Pound and Wyndham Lewis, let's say, and that's a book. I can order that and read it. But when you just exponentially or extend that to history as a whole, how history gets told, and when you think about CompuServe and these ways that we talked on bulletin boards and stuff, it's just like, how is that story going to get told when so much of it is on the internet, when search has become troubling? And how is the researcher going to do it? I mean, maybe I'm delving into unnecessary pessimism, but it just seems like we're at a moment where there's going to be a different kind of history, and I don't know that it's going to be history in the sense that we seem to have had the illusion perhaps of accuracy, or actually something much closer to accuracy.
Yeah, I think about that a lot because the communications have become very, very easy, and to do that, we communicate a lot more, but then we sort of lose a lot of it. Periodically, I'll go, like, I've downloaded all of my tweets, I'll go do that. I make sure I save all of my iMessage stuff. You can go to Gmail and you can download all of your Gmail. And I think that people might start to pay more attention to these things, and I hope they do. The problem is it's kind of like you have it, and then it's like, well, then what? And I put it onto a hard drive and donate to have my kids do it. My grandfather was very much, into computers. He passed away in the early 1980s, but he, worked for different tech companies. He was a guy that, fought in D-Day, stormed the beaches, and then went into tech and was using a Coleco Atom computer to write about computers in, 1983. And I wish I had those cassettes. I wish the stuff had his writings because, particularly now, as get to a point in life where I can appreciate that more. So I think we have to think about, like, one, how do we preserve this stuff, and with the idea that maybe, 20 years now, 50 years now, 100, maybe somebody in your family will care, or a student will care, or somebody like that. So, I love the fact that, like, one of the things I love reading, like Benjamin Franklin, is this man could write across time. I could read Benjamin Franklin right now, and I feel like this guy's speaking directly to me, and there's some value to that.
Right. Yeah, I think of it just in terms of our theme that, we want to be able to have both, not either or, but then it just kind of seems like there's this mercurial easily deprecated nature to what we're building online. And even, recently, Wayback Machine just suddenly gets taken
Oh
out.
yeah.
And it's like, well, way back to what? And it's, you could just see that happening over and over and over again, and perhaps totally happening. And this is a sci-fi plot, but there's actual, database farms, and those are open to attack, perhaps in a physical sense rather than a DDoS attack or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean that was a thing that we took for granted. Then all of a sudden, oh shoot, kind of hope that, much like when the NSA popped out of the woodwork and told NASA, hey, we have a telescope as good or better than the Hubble. Do you want it? That they might say, hey, yeah, we've got a basement in Virginia filled with the entire internet, which wouldn't surprise me.
Mm.
But yeah, we part of the problem though too is the sheer amount of information just increased tremendously, and it's a thing that you're going to need an AI to make sense of it or to find meaning or significance of it. There are projects now where people are like, hey, just connect your Google Drive or whatever, and we can train an AI to be able to answer questions and things like that for you. And I've had access to this sort of stuff, but then I kind of sit there and I go like, meh, what am I going to ask? Like, I already kind of know that. Certainly be helpful. I played with tools. There have been tools that let you kind of screen record. Uh, and I am impressed with a guy like Stephen Wolfram, who's recorded like every keystroke for like the last several decades.
Wow. Well, he is an admirer of Leibniz. And
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes any sense, but Wolfram had posted his visit to the Leibniz Museum or whatever, the House of Leibniz, and there's all these pictures of this, I don't know, graphomania that Leibniz had, just writing down so many things, and they're stored in what I guess we'd call
Newton is
like
a jerk. Yeah.
these special boxes and stuff. Um, I wonder if we're just actually maybe, well, there's two things. We talked about recursion and how things are probably going to repeat anyway. So it's not like anything could be lost, because of if there are limits on what's possible. Speaking of Leibniz, he had said, or he'd written, everything possible has an urge to exist. So there's a sense that it wouldn't really be lost. It would probably just repeat in some way that's close enough. But then the other thing, I just wonder if we're just more healthy about ownership, and not so, when we're so, oh well, we can just delete this, or that's not backed up, and if it's lost, we can find it somewhere else. Maybe that's a better thing, a healthier thing. I don't know. What do you think?
I think that that I think that you want to make sure that some of the really outlying stuff is preserved, but I do think that we find, like we talked about before, like you can pretty much predict what was tomorrow's talk show hosts are going to talk about, because there's a lot of pattern to that, and I think a lot of history is probably recomputable. Some of it won't be, and that's an idea that I've been fascinated for the longest time, though, is like, how much can I use technology to create, a time machine to go into the past is probably an impossibility as we understand, physics, but a system that could actually create an incredible replication of, ancient Rome, possible, I mean, eventually possible. And I thought about that, like how, like I think, like, should we be preserving phone books from, like, is a Los Angeles 1942 phone book maybe an immense source of value, because all of a sudden inside of there, I can build an entire network based upon who lived here, what these businesses are, whatever. And the thing we always run the risk of is, we pay attention to what we think is important, but we don't realize what's important until sometimes we've lost a thing.
Right. Yeah, the phone book example is really interesting. That sounds like a plot of a novel right there. um, well, maybe to tie things together, I would ask you this, and it's like a pet theory of mine, and I don't take it all that seriously, just fantastic thinking. It seems to me there's a fusing of memories, and I wonder to what extent human memory has an analogy in what things like ChatGPT have to do in order to process and maintain a symbolic depository from which to generate new symbols, or if it's a completely different thing. Or is it that we have like a supplementary memory now, or is it just not memory at all? Because if I let my imagination wander, or do all these things, I just wonder if, ontologically speaking, the nature of being is memory, and memory is being in some sense. So I know that's lots of things crammed into one, but I'm just wondering, like, what does memory mean now, basically?
Well, I certainly think that, I've tried to get away from the idea of just saying that there's just this filing cabinet, because as we know, when we build our memory techniques, that it's structure. Structure is incredibly important in memory. And I think that, and we find that too in AI, when you want to find an answer to a thing, we talk about things called retrieval augmented generation and whatever, and you realize that not every file folder is the same. A book, a fiction book is very different than a dictionary. A dictionary can pick up a few different discrete definitions and I'm fine. I don't need the whole of it to have value to it. But a book, if I only read a few paragraphs out of it, I'm trying to get the gist of the whole story, not the same. So I guess I would say that, like, for recall, like, do I need to remember my best friend's address? No, maybe not so much. Is it helpful for me to remember how close his house was to the park where we used to hang out? Okay, that's useful to me. The address isn't going to really affect a lot in the implicit structure, but if I'm trying to reconstruct my childhood and where I spent my time and what I did, knowing where this was and where that was is going to be key. Knowing his sister's social security number, not essential. Knowing that he had a sister, knowing that she went away to college when he was in his senior year or whatever, these things are kind of a little bit more helpful. So I think that we have to think about, like, I've been kind of been known as a generalist in AI, and that I'm, enjoy the process of going in, learning enough to kind of do a thing. But when it takes time to dive very, very deeply into a thing, I'd rather learn about some other new thing, which means I'm very useful in certain capacities, completely useless in other capacities. But I think that when we think about, like, when we try to integrate these tools and stuff into our memory, I think the best thing we can start to think about doing is offloading the things that I don't really need to know, and then helping me build scaffolding and structures to remember the things I really want to do. Because if I want to sit in a chair and have a deep thought and make connections between things, structures are going to help. That's one of the things that got me excited about AI in general, was the fact that, we talk about, Thomas Edison, inventing the light bulb, and then everybody will point out like 15 other people invented it. And how could he have invented it if it was already published in this paper of the Royal Academy, whatever? And I'm like, the same decade he invented the light bulb, Dewey Decimal System was invented. So it wasn't exactly like it was very easy to find this information.
Right.
He had to spend a tremendous amount of his wealth to find out that carbon filaments worked. Had he had, Google, he could have looked it up and found that answer to it. And I think about that a lot, about how we take for granted how easily accessible things are, but a lot of things aren't. I have a friend who's a paleontologist who pointed out when they pulled a T-Rex femur out of a basin and they couldn't fit it on the helicopter, they decided to cut it in half, which other paleontologists would just, scream at the idea of doing. But he's like, T-Rexes are easy to find. When they cut it in half, a researcher by the name of Maria Schweitzer grabbed some samples, went into the lab, fresh samples from there, put an acid on it, decalcified it, and found these gooey proteins. And my friend Jack Horner, the paleontologist, says, you think somebody at DuPont would want to know, here's a polymer that lasted 65 million years? And I'm like, yeah, but they're not looking in paleontology journals. They're not looking in those places for that kind of information because they wouldn't think to look. Mm-hmm. And that's where structure comes in. That's the idea of thinking that, like, okay, how can I use ChatGPT to be a thing that can help me be an exploratory tool to find these things? How can I use it to help teach me how to better construct my own mind? So when I try to think about these things, I can think about how to go through that, navigate that structure, and find that kind of information. So I don't know if that's really a helpful answer, but I do think that it's just, I like to think about, like, when do I need to offload it? And then when do I really need to be able to reinforce my own internal structure?
No, that is helpful. And I don't know that my etymological memory is correct here, but this is where we could do some some research using our tools. I think that invention etymologically partly comes from inventio, which really meant to discover, to explore, and possibly had an experimental tone to it. So that, I think, is a very interesting and useful point, just in terms of whatever I might say about, using memory techniques inside of your own mind and not using an external device. It's really for each person to essentially invent their own art of memory. And I would just urge them to be radically honest about it, so that it's activity that leads to accomplishment. That's really what I care about at the end of the day, rather than do it this way or do it that way kind of logic.
Well, yeah, and I'd add too that often we want to offload something because it's hard, but sometimes the reason it's hard is good. It's sometimes the reason it's hard is because, like, when I didn't learn to code, like, till much later in life. I didn't take it seriously. And I remember the first times I'd sit down and take coding classes, online. Every 30 minutes, I would literally sit down and have to lay down because my head hurt. And it, but I persisted. I continued on. Yes, I would have loved a more fun, more easy, more natural way to learn, and I would have loved to plug it in, but that wasn't there, and I had to kind of go do that. And I think that I've spent a tremendous amount of time trying to automate creation of memory palaces, a lot of this other stuff. But sometimes the work is the building. The work really is the thing that matters. And over time, it doesn't become, it's not as, I'm pretty sure you probably noticed this phenomenon too. I'm much better at remembering numbers without having to think about mnemonics for it. You used to give me a 4 or 5 digit code for my phone that I had to go type in on a screen there, and it would just be erased. But as I started coming up with memory methods to remember what these things are, the more I started to do that, now I don't even, my number retention has become better. I was listening to an audiobook and they were doing like 10-digit recall. And I'm like, oh, that was easy for me to do. Like that would have been easy for me. And I wasn't even consciously trying to do these things. So I think that's part of the advantage of playing in the work, is eventually the work does go away.
Yeah, theoretically, there is working memory expansion that is possible just from having spent some time doing encoding and decoding. But I think those results would vary depending. I mean, there's some research that I don't know that I fully understand, but some people are apparently fast encoders and some people are fast decoders. And there is a sense that you can actually shore up in either area where you may be deficient. And from what, if I understand the research correctly, very few people are good in both, but you can bring up some evenness to it. So I don't
Yeah.
know. It's interesting.
But, and the challenge there too is that we, because that's one of the things they talk about, like, yeah, digit recall is one of the things that's pretty persistent across life. But then, I would say that I had a couple kind of intellectual awakenings in my life, and I watched when I would do IQ scores, my IQ improve, and literally because I think my attention span changed, a lot of things changed, and they'd say it's relatively fixed. It's like perhaps, but and I would say that also may say more about the, understanding how to, hack your way through an IQ test. But I think the problem is we don't get enough research with really high performing individuals. We see this in sports, fitness, et cetera, where, things like spot fat reduction or in theory don't work. You can't just decide I'm going to do sit-ups to get rid of fat. But if you take an athlete that's doing 10,000 sit-ups in a day, there are other things taking place there that we really don't necessarily think about. That what happens if you contract and compose, stomach fat tissue that many times if it goes through this? Like, there's just not enough data to do that. And I think some of the things with particularly studying memory athletes is a thing that, like, there should be a lot more effort going into this, because I think that, we might find out that, like, oh no, we know the brain is extremely plastic. We know there's a lot of things in there, but if it's, the p values, we're looking for a significant value, but only 1 out of 1,000 people ever actually goes through this training. Yeah, you're never going to discover this, but it might be there. And I'm a very much a skeptic. I worked for James Randi for years. I handled $1 million prize, so I always have a very high threshold.
Right.
But I'm also very aware of, like, I talk to people about, my project right now is using AI to help accelerate the way we learn, and I bring up, like, you'd be surprised at what we don't know. We talk about, like, listening to things at a faster pace. Does doing 1x speed, 1.5, 2x speed. There's very few good studies on this, and there was a recent one done at UCLA, and they measured students during the pandemic who were listening to YouTube videos sped up. And it shows you, you go to 1.5 speeds. Most people have really good high retention. So you can crank something up if you're not listening for pleasure to like 1.5 and do a pretty good job. But the study didn't go down into what was the words per minute spoken by the speakers before the speed up, the pitch, and all these other questions you'd want to know. And you see a lot of conclusions that are often drawn without that, rapid serial visual presentation, presenting, single words at a time. There was some very interesting research in the 70s done into this, because they used to use the tachyoscope, which is what they used to train like bomber pilots and whatever, or fighter pilots looking at this. But then in the 70s, they had the PC, so they could finally use the PC. And it's interesting to read these papers where they go into refresh rates. And you start to see, like, oh, yeah, doing 2 or 3 words is probably more effective than a single word. You can actually speed this up to a point. But yeah, when you get beyond like 1,000 words per minute, then it drops off completely. But there wasn't like a lot of real long-term research into, like, well, can I train people to get better at this? Because I would imagine, if like a lot of things, you can actually probably improve people's capabilities, but we just don't have a lot of research.
Well, Now that you mentioned Randy, do you have time for one more
Absolutely.
thing? I loved Randy very much, and actually, I think one of the first times I ever had something appear on the internet from my name was something I'd submitted to JREF. I think I don't know
Mhm.
if it was the very first thing, but I don't even know if it could be found. But whatever it was, I had something I wrote that wound up on there, and he was a huge inspiration for me. And I think about the $1 million prize a lot to this
Mhm.
day. I don't know, is Banachek in charge of it now?
I
Uh,
don't think it's not really
it's
no,
not a
they've
thing.
kind of discontinued it since Randy passed. Yeah.
Um, well, in any case, where my mind is going here is that this is, to me, the tragedy of memory techniques, and it's a weird tragedy because people are right to be skeptical, and also there seems to me a category confusion. So just today, I put up something on Twitter based on a comment that I got from someone. They said, "I'm very skeptical of this. I think I'll just take lion's mane." And in that video, I said, well, this is a category confusion because there's better memory and then there's better memorization, and it's just so the memory techniques are something I can get people are skeptical about, but I never really quite get down to what is it. And I often think about what would be the prize that we could make. And the best idea that I've ever had, and it's not a very good one, I don't think, but it's I'll take any ideas that come from the memory muses, is to have like a Giordano Bruno prize where it's kind of like TEDx meets memory competitions, and you would you would need to read a book that had been released in the last 5 weeks or something like that. So you didn't have time to cheat, basically. Memorize the key points, but write a speech where you memorize your own speech and you give a presentation on that book. And there would be considerations like you would have to have so many numbers, so many unusual words that you found in the book, maybe a citation from memory verbatim, just stuff like this, like maybe 5 points that you had to hit. And then there would be this prize. I thought of going one step further and having it that it had to be about freedom of speech, but it's actually not that clear to
Mhm.
me that Bruno was quite the figure of freedom of speech that he's been made out to be. But nonetheless, that's the general idea I've always had. And I've always had the Randy Prize in mind because it seemed to me that it would help deal with the skepticism because people would be encouraged to, oh man, there's that kind of money here. I'll figure out how to memorize this stuff. And then it would also be a kind of way of, I don't know, just popularizing it more and quote unquote proving to so many people that their skepticism is right, but it's misguided and misplaced. And then maybe help erase this category confusion that there is such a thing as general memory improvement that's going to come from using memory palaces. I mean, it's a very specific targeted thing that we're
Mm.
talking about. And this, if you want general memory improvement, then maybe lion's mane is the thing, or walking backwards qigong kind of stuff, which has been shown to have some effect. Anyway, I just since you mentioned Randy, I wanted that just gushed out of me.
Well, yeah, I certainly think that like there's something to be said for people just understanding that there's even a conversation about this, that there are these differences, there is that. Um, and I would say that, one of the things that I thought was interesting is that, and I don't mean this as going to sound more terrible than I mean it to say. I think some of the worst advocates for learning some of these memory techniques are memory athletes. And I think memory athletes are phenomenal and do amazing things because the problem is when you ask somebody what's it good for, and inherently I would do this too. Well, your shopping list. Like, okay, everything my notes app does. Like that's not really helpful to me. And I think that you go back to, like you said, like a really classical example. It's like, well, imagine being able to name all of the founding fathers and explain something about their history, where they came from. That would be really useful because then when you find yourself talking about questions of liberty or this or stuff and understanding that. And I think that when you start to say, okay, I'm not going to help you figure out, when they say like, well, like here's how to remember where your keys are. Imagine giant keys you left by your front door. And like, it's kind of cool, but it's not as engaging as I think it's going to back. Why did we use in the first place? We used in the first place was to bolster our ability to make arguments, to be able to recall things that were important, et cetera. That when we encountered information, to be able to not just process it and have it go through and use it. So I tend to think like, yeah, I think something like you said is like if you started to think about like, oh, can we encourage people to think about how they can really use this to bolster their intellect? How to make yourself, we're always impressed when somebody gets on the debate stage and has all the facts and figures and numbers. I really loved watching like Christopher Hitchens debate something. Like
Yes.
I wouldn't necessarily always agree with him, but I'm like, that guy knew his stuff. And I was impressed by this because guys like him, they can read a book and live inside of the book. And so I certainly think that something along those lines would be great and kind of show like, and I don't mean to be dismissive again of like some of the stuff that gets to propose it, but it's like, and the real value is harder to sometimes articulate, but it is like, it's not like, imagine reading a book, then being able to discuss that book at length and remember the quotes like that other guy could.
Mm. Yeah. Well, I have that same criticism and I've made it. And when I met Tony Buzan, I thought he was going to hate me because of all that stuff that I've said that's similar to yours, even with a slightly more uh, jaded edge sometimes. But he just embraced me. He thought that was a totally valid criticism. And it is kind of a weird thing because of the memory competitions who also learn languages or whatever, it's kind of they are there, but it's sort of a limited set. So in any case, there's so much in this memory thing, and I'm glad that you're
Mm.
on team memory for humanity at large. And anytime we can talk further, I would love to do that. But for now, for people who would love to learn more about your novels and the work that you're doing in AI, what's the best place for them to go?
My blog is andrewmayne.com. That's Andrew, Mayne.com. You'll see I post infrequently, but I talk mostly about AI and some methods there. I'm pretty active on Twitter, so at Andrew Mayne on X. A lot more. I talk mainly about AI, mainly about that. And I'm also like, if you have questions, whatever, I'm always happy to talk about that. It's like I feel like you brought something up which is important, which is people feel like this is something happening to them. And I'm very eager to engage with people as somebody who comes from a background of the arts and entertainment, and I understand there's just a lot of fear and hesitation there. I'm always very happy to talk about people and present my point of view and why I think this is going to be, we're entering a golden age for artists. I think this is going to be an incredible opportunity. An example I bring up is if I showed somebody a camera in 1837, a portrait artist might be panicking, thinking my job has ended. What's going to happen to artists? What are you going to do? But if I tried to explain to them what James Cameron did for a living, it would be almost impossible.
Right.
The crew size for people working on Avatar 2 or an Avengers Endgame was like equal to half the size of the United States Army in 1837 in non-adjusted dollars. The budget for those movies were bigger than the entire treasury, and like the size and scope that we forget how big of a space the arts have taken over in our lives, that an average person can think about becoming an artist or making a living from this has increased dramatically. That the percentage of people who actually make a living writing now is phenomenal comparatively in any point in history.
Mm.
You can make a very comfortable living as an artist, and I don't see that going away. I see that increasing.
I think so too. In some sense, one thing that often comes to my mind is that AI is the new camera obscura in a way.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, we won't all be Vermeer, but nonetheless, assuming he did use it, but I think so.
It'd
It's
be a
just
lot
that.
harder if he didn't, because like,
Yes, well, there's a good documentary about that I have a feeling about. But in any case, I really, really appreciate it. It's given me. I've always tried to follow Buzan's advice to always focus on what can go right, but this has given me even more hope than before. So thank you for that, and look forward to speaking again sometime.
thank you so much, Anthony.
I want to thank Andrew again for joining me on the Magnetic Memory Method podcast, and thank you for being part of it, for your thumbs up, for your comments, if you're watching on YouTube, or coming to visit the blog and commenting there, and just generally being part of this project. Because one of the things that we didn't really quite talk about is the risk of narcissism, of just doing everything on our own. Maybe not narcissism, that might not be the right word, but just plunking around with the tools on our own may wind up isolating a lot of us from one another. And that's kind of sad, because one of the great things about using memory techniques is that we can use them to remember what we're saying to each other in real life situations. And we can be prepared, as I believe Socrates wanted us to be prepared, to defend ourselves in arguments, or to just persuade each other better when we have our own positions that may differ with other people. So we need that mental sharpness, and we need to get together. So thanks for being part of this. Thanks again to Andrew. And if you want to follow along with, I think, another very, very interesting conversation that follows naturally from this, check out the interview where Nelson Dellis, who's now 6-time USA memory champion, he and I talk about another kind of technology, which is things like remote viewing, and I play a kind of magic trick on him, and it plays out in a very, very weird way. But you'll have to watch that or listen to that next. So thank you again, and until we have a chance to speak again, keep yourself magnetic.